Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit in Higher Education. I'm Ruby Woodside at Second Nature, and I'm joined today by Ned Gardner, who's the Engagement Manager for the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Today, we will talk about how schools can use the Climate Resilience Toolkit to build campus climate resilience. Next slide. So I just want to mention that today's webinar is the first in a series of 3 webinars on resilience planning that Second Nature is offering in partnership with the Climate Resilience Toolkit. So the next webinar will be at the same time in 2 weeks, and in that webinar we'll hear about some of the work that California State University Long Beach is doing, and we'll also hear from a firm working on analyzing the financial risk of climate change. So during the final webinar, we'll hear case studies from Tufts University and Portland State University about some of the resilience planning work that they're doing. So I do hope that you can join us for these future webinars as well. And you can go to Second Nature's website to find the links to register or look out for emails from us. Next slide. Great, so I'm just going to jump right in here. Most people have probably already seen this image before. These are the key steps to implementing the resilience component of the climate commitment. So today on the webinar, we're going to hear about how the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit can support schools in each stage of this commitment implementation. And I do want to point out that most campuses that are part of the commitment that have either signed the resilience or the climate commitment, most of them are in the stages of assessing resilience or planning for increasing resilience. So essentially the timeline that Second Nature recommends is that schools have at least a year after signing the commitment to complete a resilience assessment. And many schools have already submitted their resilience assessment reports in Second Nature's reporting platform. And then after that, the next step is for schools to create a climate action plan or to incorporate resilience-related goals into existing climate action plans. So just as a reminder to folks on the webinar today, these plan updates are due by next May. So folks should really be thinking about how they'll complete the resilience planning process at their schools. And then what we're hoping is that this webinar series, and today's webinar especially, can really help kickstart the process at campuses and point people towards some resilience planning resources that you can take advantage of. Next slide. So this is also an image that most folks have probably seen, but I just wanted to put it up here again for a minute. It outlines the same key steps for the resilience commitment, but in a different format. So what you see here, the Campus Community Task Force, the Resilience Assessment, and the Climate Action Plan, those are the points in the process where schools submit the public reports through our reporting platform. But really, it's up to campuses to determine the best process, for each campus and for each school. So for example, the resilience assessment will probably include some type of future scenario planning and assessment of vulnerability and climate risk. However, each campus can really mold the process to best fit their needs. And then, again, for climate action planning, there'll definitely be some type of prioritizing solutions and decision making, but each campus will go through a slightly different process to do so. And then another thing I do want to point out is that these 2 graphs, I think, make the process seem very linear and very clean cut, but I think in reality that's not really the case. So the idea here is that this really just provides some guidance, but each school is going to follow somewhat of a different path. Next slide. So just as a quick update, there are over 100 schools that are currently working on either the climate or the resilience commitment, and you can see those schools here on the map. About 35 of them have submitted their resilience assessment reports already, and they're very interesting, and a number more have completed resilience workshops and are currently synthesizing results. So if you're interested, you can see the reports on our reporting platform. Also, as I mentioned previously, a lot of schools are in different stages of the resilience planning process and have taken different approaches. So some have completed a, much more qualitative assessment to begin with, and then as they think about developing a plan and goals around resilience, they may want to do a more in-depth, more data-driven vulnerability assessment. At the same time, some schools did a very extensive resilience assessment and are ready to prioritize action steps. And then some are just getting started with the process. And so today we're going to talk through how the toolkit has some resources and tools to help schools that are at any point of this process. Next slide. So what is resilience? I just wanted to include really quickly here both Second Nature's definition of resilience and then how the toolkit talks about resilience. So you've probably heard, Second Nature, we talk about resilience as the ability of a system or community to survive disruption and to anticipate, adapt, and flourish in the face of change. The Climate Resilience Toolkit talks about resilience as the capacity of a community, business, or natural environment to prevent, withstand, respond to, and recover from a disruption. So I just want to point out that there are differences in the wording and how we talk about resilience, but both kind of include the systems perspective and talk about being able to prepare for and recover from changes. And then the charts here are also a common depiction of resilience. So, many people will view daily life kind of going along a pretty flat baseline. However, when we talk about resilience, the resilience of a system will determine how you respond when there are disruptions in that baseline. And so Second Nature talks about, not only just being able to bounce back to the status quo, but really thinking about building a more positive future for everyone. Next slide.
Oops, wrong direction, excuse me.
It's fine. And then on the bottom here are some of the 5 core tenets of resilience from some of Second Nature's materials that you've probably seen. But, we really emphasize thinking about community, flexibility, inclusiveness, learning, and then also prevention and management as kind of different different characteristics that are going to be present in a resilient system. Next slide. So just as a quick reminder, Second Nature has many existing tools and resources that schools are already using. Many schools have used these to complete their resilience assessment, and they can also be used during the planning process as well. And you can follow the links on the bottom to our website to learn more about these particular tools. But I just want to mention it includes the Community Resilience Building Workshop from the Nature Conservancy that a lot of schools have done. And then more recently, we completed a tool that we call the Campus Evaluation of Resilience Dimensions, which is a survey that schools can use for the resilience assessment. And then, also just keep in mind that any of these tools and frameworks can be used in conjunction with the resources that we're talking about today from the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. So I do think that a lot of the existing resources really complement each other very well. Next slide. Okay, and so before I turn it over to you, Ned, I just wanted to briefly review the dimensions of resilience and how these dimensions will be carried forward into the climate action planning process for schools. So schools that are working on their resilience assessments should definitely be thinking about these 5 dimensions of resilience that Second Nature talks about often, which are economic, health and wellness, social equity and governance, ecosystem services, and infrastructure. One thing to keep in mind is that these dimensions are not mutually exclusive. The idea is really that in doing the assessment and assessing the current status, schools need to really think holistically about resilience and consider the entire campus community system. So for the resilience assessment, as folks probably know, Second Nature asks schools to report on the strengths, vulnerabilities, and current status in each dimension. So for the initial report, this could be kind of very early stage and qualitative. But in a few minutes, we'll hear from Ned how schools can go into more detail as they work towards their climate action plan. So for the planning process, under the commitments, schools will not be required to set goals for each of the 5 dimensions. But I do think it's helpful for schools to keep this framework in mind when you're developing their plans, but do know that it's up to each school to decide which areas to focus their work and efforts on. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ned. Just a quick reminder for folks listening on the webinar, if you do have any questions, we're going to have some time for questions and answers at the end. So at any point during the webinar, you can type your questions into the chat box on your screen, and we'll hopefully answer them at the end. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Ned.
Thanks, Ruby, and thanks for this opportunity to work with all of you. And when I say work with you, I want to emphasize from the very outset that I'm going to share my contact information with you at the end of this webinar, and I encourage you to be in touch because all of us on the Toolkit team are very interested in hearing from you and discussing what issues you might be having. And so Ruby and I are committed to gathering questions and addressing them. And so we'll address that at the end of the talk. The elephant in the room when working together will be that we, as Ruby said, we both were Second Nature and the Climate Resilience Toolkit are both addressing this systemic issue of building resilience to climate-related hazards. And Second Nature has taken the very practical and realistic stance that in order to do that, there's an iterative process of evaluating what needs to be done and addressing those issues through both analysis and planning and action. On the Toolkit team, we took the same problem and are breaking it into deliberately a linear structure that we call the steps to resilience. In reality, I agree with Ruby 100% that these steps are taken iteratively, asynchronously, and must be done in a way that's suitable for your team. However, what we've done in building the steps to resilience has gone across a lot of different domains of literature and pulled out the essential elements needed to build an adaptation plan and enact it, answering key questions along the way so that there's a logic and a progression to a comprehensive approach. And because this is an emerging field, building resilience and climate resilience particularly, we have found in working with communities of all sorts that this language and shared understanding is an important first step for establishing communication. Now, so in today's webinar, I'm going to address how the Steps to Resilience framework ties together the tools that we have available in our toolkit, and by tools I mean reports and data and literally interactive tools, but also resources from the National Climate Assessment and the big vetted resources that are available. And I'll touch on some of those things and I want to get a feeling from this community of how much people are familiar with these different tools. I'll touch on the Climate Explorer, which is our bespoke analysis tool, and I'll refer a bit to Second Nature resources. We're really hoping that all of you will be very active in the chat box and generate questions, and that we can have a discussion about all of this. So to start off, just setting the stage, so many of you may not have ever visited the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit, which is essentially the latest chapter in the U.S. government taking uber nerdy climate science and making it more accessible for people making decisions in different areas of the U.S. economy. So what we've done is we've taken tools and resources and packaged them with this framework of the steps to resilience so that you can make better decisions. And the URL, it's here on the bottom. Feel free, I wouldn't know anyway, since this is a webinar, but feel free to go check out the website while I'm talking. It's based on a federal partnership of over 13 agencies and departments that are all part of the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which was mandated by Congress in 1990. None of that is probably important to you, except for the fact that this does represent a cohesive effort by different agencies throughout the government to provide you something useful. And so all of us in all of these agencies want to hear back from you about what is useful. And we're really interested in that because we want you to be able to do your work. We see the STEPS framework itself as being able to help you issue or respond to requests for proposals. So you and your counterparts in your host city may want to respond to a funding call and get funding to do some resilience planning. The language in the toolkit and the framework that I'm going over today can be very helpful in organizing a response to a solicitation like that. Or you can use this language as a common platform for working with contractors so that you have a shared understanding about what you're doing. For that reason, and not to bore you, I'm going to go over some terminology that we think is very important that people share, because there's a lot of terminology in climate science and adaptation planning that, if used incorrectly or vaguely, can lead folks down the wrong path. We want to see people walking on the same path, so I'll spend a little time introducing you to some of that terminology. And then, of course, the tools and methods that we're going over are applicable where you live. And as Ruby and I were discussing before the webinar today, we're happy to field questions and customize some and look for tools that can specifically help you where you live and work. So we're hoping you'll be able to use our toolkit to support the steps to resilience as part of your work with Second Nature. And I think you'll find you will be able to. So what are these steps? Yes, there are 5 sequential steps. We're going to go through that. They've got specific key questions that can keep you focused on your task at hand. But what it comes down to is moving beyond, did you know that a specific problem existed? So did you know it's getting warmer? Did you know precipitation events are getting more extreme? Moving beyond that kind of knowledge gaining into why should you even care about it involves evaluating specific resources or assets that you're responsible for. And then ultimately, none of this would matter at all if we weren't also giving you resources to help you do something to address the problem. So that's what we aim to do with this toolkit. And if you'll bear with me for several more minutes, we'll go through these steps. The idea is, yes, we know we're federal agencies, and we're very cognizant of the fact that that can lead to a top-down kind of thinking, but instead, what we've done is we've worked with contractors who've been working with city governments on resilience plans and developed a much more bottom-up framework to organize the information in the toolkit. And the very first step is exploring hazards. Now, what do I even mean by that? I know that everyone on this phone call probably has responsibilities or resources, but you're not. But some of you are at different. You're all probably at different degrees of understanding what your exposure is of those resources. So in this step, we're going to go over processes to get you focused at the right scale. It's also the biggest step. So as Ruby said, you know, taking a year between evaluating your hazards and developing a plan, that sounds like a good idea to me, and you could easily fill that year. So exploring hazards involves team building, understanding climate information, as well as the ways that climate influences hazards, and doing an asset inventory so that you can directly evaluate exposure. So I'll go over all of that. Ruby's going to put a URL in your chat box, and I've also listed it here. And so as I'm talking, please visit this website or use your phone and text to this number this string, and that will sign you up to be able to participate in a few polls that we're going to run during this conversation. And right now, I'd like for you to report to us an asset, a resource, or a population that you are responsible for protecting. So, and we'll just develop a word cloud of what folks on the call right now are interested in, or that have responsibility for protecting. So while you're doing that, just briefly, I'll touch on this idea of team building, which is so important. It's so important to second nature as well. So you have, as your first step, this campus community structure, report, and developing a team. So this is not news to you about building a team. We'd like to emphasize the two R's, that your team should include people who have responsibility for an asset, a population, a resource. So it could be a community park, it could be a population of students, it could be a right of way that people in your host city and your university use, and you have responsibility for keeping it safe. Or perhaps you have resources, so you've got funding from the state to provide a certain service, and so that person should be on your team developing your guidance around exploring hazards all the way through taking action. So building a team's an essential process, and it gets into inclusion and social equity, environmental justice. And so there are quite a few case studies that we have that look at different ways different communities are addressing this issue. And I know Ruby's got resources to support that as well. We also have an entire webinar on September 6th where we focus on this issue of coordinating between universities and so town and gown coordination. So tune in then, and we'll dive into this subject a little bit more. At this point, no one has responded to my survey. So please jump in, and rather than wait, I think I'm going to move on there we go. So someone put in students, and of course, that's probably your primary responsibility. Good. So people are concerned a lot about the community itself, the faculty, the students, the buildings and infrastructure. And that's exactly what I expected to see from this community today. And of course, the size of the word there means that more and more people are entering those words. So thanks for that input. I see green spaces, and if you use two words, by the way, it shows up as two words. It separates those in the word cloud, so you can elide your words if you want them to show up in the cloud. I'm going to move on. Let's see if I've missed anything. Workers. I think we want to keep these ideas in mind as we move on. I'm going to deactivate the poll. Well, no, I won't deactivate the poll. I'll leave this running while I go, and then we'll activate another one in a moment. So in order to explore climate-related hazards, we have a few definitions to get out of the way. First of all, hazards themselves. So this is taken from a publication. This chart on the left is taken from a publication by emergency managers, which separates hazards according to natural and human-caused events or technology-caused events. And among natural events, we can see a number of meteorological events. So all of these clearly would have a climate influence. But what's interesting here is that there are other kinds of events, even geological events, that climate can exacerbate. So we saw with the fires last year in California, especially, quite a lot of confluence of factors, mudslides, and so the combination of rain with geology is an important thing to consider. We're talking about climate as a multiple influencer of different kinds of hazards. Here in Western North Carolina, where I live, we even have arsonists who light fires in wilderness areas during dry seasons because they know they're going to be successful. So there's a human behavior combination with climate. In big cities, there's more crime during heat waves. So human behavior and climate interact. The point here is that understanding the climate influences on hazards requires a systems perspective, and mapping out these hazards and then looking for the influence of climate on those hazards is a big part of understanding climate resilience. So we can break that down in a simple way as understanding a hazard as it relates to an asset, and that could be people or infrastructure, and looking for the climate component or non-climate components. So non-climate stressors could include population growth and urban sprawl on urban heat islands, for instance, whereas the climate stressor itself might be more heat waves or greater evaporative demand. So understanding the climate component and how it differs from non-climate is a big part of our job in providing you appropriate data and resources to look at your hazards and assets. Now, I know I'm getting into terminology. If you need me to slow down, chat into the chat window. Ruby will be monitoring that, and I can slow down. But I will move on in the interest of time unless I hear from folks. So a big part of the toolkit, I mentioned that we're part of the U.S. Global Change Research Program team. Their primary responsibility is generating the National Climate Assessment, which evaluates climate impacts in the United States and does so on a periodic basis. There's a new climate assessment coming out this year. There's a science special report that's out now that you can read. And for every region of the country, you'll see high-level messages about critical climate-related hazards that are occurring in that region. So these results come from vetted research and are aggregated at a regional level. So what I want to emphasize for you is that these regions are fairly large relative to the size of a campus, okay? And so while these are very important results to be aware of, they may or may not suit your particular needs for your campus resilience plan. We also, in the latest climate assessment, have a resource called State Summaries, and at statesummaries.ncics.org, you can go in right now, even while I'm talking, and find high-level results for every state in the union that tell you what are the big messages in the upcoming assessment for the state where you live. Again, very important, critical information, but maybe not all that helpful at a city level. So I'm interested to hear from you now about any hazard. I'm going to, while I keep talking, I'd like you to tell me about hazards that you may be facing. And so by hazard, I mean something like flooding or heat waves or something of that nature. And just use the same link that Ruby sent out before, and we'll continue the conversation. Just as an example, this is a process that emergency managers, and many of you may be emergency managers or may work with emergency managers in cities or at the state level, but this is a process that emergency managers are very familiar with because every 5 years, FEMA requires that emergency managers put together an emergency response plan, which is based on understanding a variety of different hazards. So the hazards here are listed on the left side of this table, and this is taken from the Massachusetts Multi-Hazard Mitigation Plan, which came out this past year. And then at the top, notice that the different counties in Massachusetts are all listed. So different counties have different hazards. Some of them are coastal counties, some are not, for instance. And so they're going to be dealing with different aspects of different parts of this table are more relevant for different counties. But also notice that here, for any given hazard, a manager might be interested in knowing what's happening at a state level or a local level. So state level hazards do affect municipal and county governments if it disrupts the economy. And likewise, you'll need to know about local issues in order to respond at a local level. So having a multi-scale understanding of hazards and the climate influence on those is actually part of the routine day-to-day job of an emergency manager. So if you're not one of these people, you'll be wanting to work with one because it takes some of this complexity and breaks it down into something manageable. They understand how to go about doing that work. So here we are looking at some of the hazards that folks are focused on. I'm guessing that extreme heat is one of them. We have two words, extreme and heat, that look about the same size. So I'm guessing that those are the same. And these are the exact words I would expect. I would have expected floods to be very high in this list. That if we look at a national level, inland flooding is the biggest hazard that folks are concerned about. But yeah, it's up there in the upper left. So, oh, and then there's two different ways flood shows up. So there we go. I just didn't see that at first. And there's coastal flooding and inland flooding that both affect communities. So it looks like this community on the phone call is pretty much in line with what I would expect on a national level as well. Allow me to pull up resources for any of these after the webinar. If you feel like you go into the toolkit and you don't see what you need for addressing your hazards, I'd like to help you find what you need for that specific hazard. I'm going to open another poll now to look at climate stressors. And so this is getting, I'm just wanting to track whether you're following the connection between the hazard and how climate might influence that stressor. So if you have a two-word answer, just make it one word in your response so we can read it, and we'll just squint our eyes and ignore the grammatical problem there. So while you're filling that survey out, I just want to emphasize or mention rather that we've built a tool called the Climate Explorer that takes you past the regional level, past the state level, both of which I addressed above with the state summaries and the National Climate Assessment. And we now are giving you historical observations and climate projections at a zip code level, actually really at a county level for every county in the United States in the form of our Climate Explorer. So if you want to check out the Climate Explorer, you go to toolkit.climate.gov and follow the link to use the Climate Explorer. And then you can search by location and just put in your zip code, your city, or a county, and you'll start to see some results. We don't have time to do a fully interactive tour of this tool today, but if you're interested, I can certainly answer questions and we can go back into this at the discussion time. But what I want to emphasize for you now, while I have your attention, is on our homepage. This is what you will see when you go down to the Climate Explorer. Of course, this button right here is going to bring up the tool itself. Now, my colleague, Luann Dahlman, has put together a Esri story map where the tool is embedded within a frame-based website where you can see definitions of things that you're looking at. So, for instance, this is a kind of a chart that you would get in the climate by location module, and there are a lot of elements of this chart. These bars that go up and down represent the observed history of that site, of this county. The gray envelope that's shown here, this gray envelope, represents the reconstructed model for this time period. And then these two envelopes, red and blue, represent different climate emissions pathways. Excuse me, not emissions pathways, but forcing pathways. So a representative concentration of 8.5 watts per meter squared of forcing by greenhouse gases by the end of the century in the red, and 4.5 watts per meter squared in blue. And this is showing you the trajectory of how average daily maximum temperature might change in this county over the coming century. So all of that is explained if you go into this this explanatory module here, and then we have other learning tools available to you as well. But we're pretty proud of the Climate Explorer and want you to check it out. So please do feel free to ask me questions at the end of the webinar at any time if you're interested. Okay, so now here we're looking at the climate stressors, and good, high intensity rainfall is definitely a climate stressor. So the changing in intensity of rainfall is a well-documented climate impact, as is drought and heat waves. So violence would be a non-climate stressor. And so being able to distinguish between, but climate can stress violence as well, can stress social factors. So violence might be a hazard that you're concerned about as well. The response about students, you may be concerned about student safety or student health, I'm not sure, but that would be more of either a population you're concerned about rather than a climate stressor. Yeah, increased temperatures, higher intensity rainfall, greenhouse gas emissions, interesting. So greenhouse gas emissions fall into the mitigation side of things, which is a big part of your climate commitments, but not something that we touch on in our toolkit very much. There are other resources available for touching on greenhouse gas emissions from NOAA and other agencies, but not in our toolkit. Okay, I'm going to move on, and if anyone has questions, of course, feel free. I'll deactivate that. Well, I'll leave the poll open. Why not? That was the last poll of our conversation. So from here on out, I'm just going to buzz through a fair amount of just some terms and just to help you develop a shared vocabulary with folks who do climate resilience building. So in this exploring hazards, now you've already done your team building and you're exploring the climatological influences on hazards and listing hazards. Now you want to do an asset inventory and link them to the hazards. So for instance, and I discussed this in terms of emergency management and the FEMA required process, but building a matrix of the assets you're responsible for and the hazards that might influence those assets allows you to quickly see what your high priority hazards are, the ones that touch on many different assets. This was taken from Asheville, North Carolina, where I live, and by far the greatest monetary costs due to climate-related hazards here. It deals with flooding as well as landslides. So right off the bat, we know what our really important hazards are by building a matrix like this, and it's a really essential, helpful part of building resilience to know what you're exposed to and what are the really frequent exposures that you have to deal with. So we're finishing up step one with an understanding that climate and weather represent hazards to assets that we value. And I mentioned North Carolina, Asheville, North Carolina, and flooding, but we had other hazards as well. And so we can go into the next step of assessing vulnerability and risk. So this gets at a deeper level understanding of what the exposure is. How do we rank different exposures? If you have different kinds of assets and different risks, how do we use vulnerability and risk analysis to rank priority focal problems? I think that's probably a problem that many of you are grappling with. So to do that, you would go into step 2 here. You're determining your exposure, assessing vulnerability, and then estimating risk so that you can determine whether there are really high priority risks that you need to address. So this is probably the most terminology heavy slide in the whole presentation, but it's an important one. I've been talking about exposure, which is an asset or a population that can be influenced by drought, heat waves, flooding, heavy precipitation. I don't remember all of the hazards that you all listed, but it's the sensitivity of each one of those assets or populations or resources that determines the potential impact. So we have to, exposure is the combination of assets and hazards, and sensitivity is a trait of that asset to that hazard that gives us an idea of potential impact. Now, over here is this very important concept of adaptive capacity, which is, does your community have social cohesion so that people can help one another through a crisis? Do you have monetary resources to put in place so that if there's a fuel outage for your university, you have a way to pay for alternative fuel? Or do you have alternative generators for electricity? Is there adaptive capacity during an emergency? Yesterday, we had a lightning storm where I work, and the building was shut down. Now, most people have telework policies, and they're able to essentially work from home. So we have some adaptive capacity to deal with an emergency like that. In this case, it just resulted in a couple hours of free time, and people were pretty happy about it. But you get the idea that during a longer-term disruption, ultimately your vulnerability is a function of all of these factors. If there is less adaptive capacity in place and you have a sensitive resource, you've got a vulnerability in the system that will kick in if a tipping point is reached. So hopefully I've addressed what those terms mean, and through practice it becomes easier and easier to use these terms, but it's also important to be specific about what you mean about each of them so that you're on the same page with the person you're talking to. We do a fair amount of engagements with communities, such as this one that we conducted in Marquette, Michigan, and people that we were working with went through the process of describing assets, hazards, sensitivity, adaptive capacity, and then coming up with a ranked vulnerability score. These vulnerabilities are assessed based on criteria determined by the team that we were working with. And out of this analysis, there was a consensus about what the most important resources to consider are in this community. So it's very valuable to be able to go through a prioritization like this vulnerability analysis. Also, there are a number of commercial geographical information system solutions available now that either exist or that you can develop to come up with your own exposure and vulnerability analyses. So as university communities, everyone on this phone call probably has access to technological resources to map out exposure and vulnerability to lead into a vulnerability analysis and perhaps even risk. So that's the subject of its own webinar, and I'm happy to field questions about that afterward. To get to risk, we kind of left off the vulnerability discussion with this idea of a consequence that would emerge. Now, incorporating the likelihood that this will happen, we can come up with an estimate or an agreed upon valuation of risk. So when we combine the magnitude of the consequence and the probability of hazard, we can agree on things that are high risk and low risk. And of course, climate change often can shift the probability of a hazard toward a higher probability or lower probability, shifting its risk as a result. And we're interested in identifying those kinds of shifts as we think about future resilience planning. And this very confusing matrix, just zero in on the idea that there's high red risk areas that are all pulled out of a matrix based on that Massachusetts multi-hazard mitigation plan I showed you before. And the red boxes bring attention toward the highest risk issues that need addressing in a emergency response plan, which you can bring climate information in on top of to help improve your estimation of your risk. So the asset hazard pairs ultimately have vulnerability rankings and risk ranking, and that gives your team a sense of where the exposure is that you cannot accept risk from. So that's the end of step 2. Now we're moving into the planning phase of planning and implementation phase of your climate action plans. And in our toolkit, we break that down into steps where we've got investigating options, prioritization, and the taking action itself is a step beyond the plan. So I'll briefly touch on these ideas. To investigate options, a lot of you, I imagine, a lot of communities that I've run into really start here. They want to know, what can we do now, today? And our Steps to Resilience emphasizes that we can help. It's possible to prioritize what to focus on by going through that laborious process of steps 1 and 2 here. And by having that ranked list and then bringing that forward, then you can begin considering solutions. And so if there's an efficiency to be gained here by following the steps to resilience, that's what it is. There are several ways to improve resilience. You can reduce exposure, build adaptive capacity, reduce sensitivity through building materials and revetments, or improve response and recovery. We won't delve into these in depth today, but the point is that there are different ways to address targeting those risks that you identified. We built our toolkit on the capacity to see how others have responded and to benchmark your own work with other case studies. So we've got 150, 200, something like that, case studies from all around the nation and territories that enumerate different strategies and different geographies and different hazards that people are facing, some ways that people have been approaching climate resilience in the past. So it's a big part of our platform to provide you that benchmarking. There are also other websites from private organizations like EcoAdapt's Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or the Georgetown Climate Center's Legal Options Toolkit that provide benchmarking capacity through case studies. So if you have questions about that, don't hesitate to first look at our case studies and reach out, and we can help you find someone who's doing something similar to what you want to do. And of course, getting people to buy in, perhaps not by looking at their cell phone, but by being engaged in the process of dialogue to come up with what are the priorities to focus on and develop strategies that directly address the concerns people have. That's an important part of developing your options and getting people on the same page about what people are willing to support to move forward. And then we'll move into prioritization. And I imagine most of the people on this webinar know a lot about this subject because you're within bureaucracies and administrations. But climate planning does introduce some useful and sometimes complex subjects. I'm going to fly through this pretty quickly. It really comes down to evaluating costs and benefits, ranking expected values, and integrating the highest value actions into a plan of some sort. So the prioritization itself can include, for instance, some of the ideas that Ruby introduced in the beginning of the webinar today, such as improving infrastructure resilience, improving ecosystem services, looking at social equity and environmental justice, economic feasibility, health and wellness. The point is that your team comes up with what criteria they want to address, as well as the ways that different levels of service for each of those would be achieved by a given option, so that they can all be evaluated side by side. So here's a matrix where we've taken 5 of these potential categories in the top row here and put them across the top. Now let's say our team on this phone call all agreed on how to evaluate each one of these on criteria that we all agree. Then we can say, you know, red means no, we can't do it. Yellow means maybe we can do it, and green means, oh yeah, no problem, we can meet the criteria for each of these independently. We might build a matrix then that goes through and lists out for a given set of options the feasibility for each category of each option. And so we can see in this particular table, we don't really have an option that meets all of our criteria. So we'd be looking for a way to develop an option that meets all the criteria. So one of the benefits of having done a comprehensive asset mapping is that we bring people together across different departments to develop a shared understanding of the co-benefits of a given strategy. So this example that I'm showing here is the City of Pittsburgh's plan for open space, which Rand Corporation developed. And it got the people in the police department and the health department and education and safety and so forth, all thinking together about the ways that open spaces could be managed so that flooding is ameliorated, ecosystems are restored, and human livelihoods are improved, and budgets can be pulled together to meet multiple objectives together. So in that example now, we have we've eliminated the choices that don't meet one of our criteria because we're not going to move ahead on those. Now we've got these 2 middle ground options, but maybe we can combine them and join forces and develop yet another option that meets multiple criteria in one pass. So that's the idea of this planning process, and we'll have another webinar in 2 weeks about understanding the financial incentives for your climate commitments and the funding mechanisms that have proven helpful at the California State University Long Beach campus. So tune in then. We can dive in a little bit more into some of this financial and planning, these financial and planning aspects of developing a plan. So scenario planning is one method for looking at the future and evaluating hazards based on specific problems. And in scenario planning, you're looking at a solution that meets a need for a period of time. And then at that time, you have a choice between different options that might take you down the road to another decision point that you can defer until later, at which point you've got to make another choice. Now, this idea is being implemented in the corporate world, such as in water utilities today, and it's a good idea to consider how you might put in adaptation pathways that preserve options in the future, so that you don't have to pay for everything today, but B, you preserve your options for better solutions in the future. That's the idea of that kind of scenario planning. And then the idea is to incorporate your climate-informed resilience planning into existing strategies, a city comprehensive plan or sustainability plan. And I mentioned hazard mitigation efforts. So there already exist required and agreed upon methods for doing planning, and incorporating climate resilience into those might be a lot easier than initiating a process that's independent and complex in its own right. Ultimately, the plan has to represent a group's evaluation of what is in its best interest to protect its highest risk assets. So now we're ready to move into taking action, and you've done all that hard work, but you can get to work with the confidence that you've done everything you can to address the most important issues that your community is facing, and maximize the return on your investment through monitoring and reporting, sharing, and doing the adaptation work. So that's what this step emphasizes. It's a lot more than just implementation. You're going to you're going to empower the people who have the responsibility to do the work, and the administrators with the resources are going to get on board and help make this plan a reality when you're successful. The monitoring and evaluation and communication are very important parts of implementation. So here I'm highlighting Marcia Hilmus Robinson from Fort Collins, Colorado, where they've done a lot of floodplain mitigation work, and it's been very successful over time. And I encourage you to check out their case study in the toolkit. And I also encourage you to share your case study. We have easy to use templates to submit case studies. Obviously, you have your own reporting schema. Participate in it. It's very important for this community to grow by building Second Nature's library. And know that the things you do today are one step in a long-term process, and persistent adaptation will be part of our future. So I haven't left a lot of time for discussion, but I am interested, even if we don't have time today, to hear what next steps you're going to take. I want to leave you with this idea of a resilience ecosystem, because it's one of the most exciting things that's emerging in my world right now, is that we've moved beyond working with our federal partners and are working directly with the private sector folks who are providing resilience services through foundation-funded efforts, through nonprofits, and through for-profit businesses. So by working together, we're going to do this work in our generation as the first generation to really take this on in earnest. So Ruby, if you want to field a couple questions, I have time, or if you want to take this into the email realm, that's fine with me as well.
Thanks, Ned. So that was really great, and just as I know that was a lot of information, and I just want to really encourage folks to check out the Climate Resilience Toolkit, because that was kind of just the tip of the iceberg for the resources that are there. We don't really have time for many questions. Let's see, I did have just a quick one that I think you could answer now, and then maybe for some of the longer ones, we'll just respond to folks directly over email. But someone asked earlier, who developed the National Climate Assessment?
Okay. So in 1990, George H.W. Bush signed into law the Global Change Research Act, which authorized the National Climate Assessment and the formation of the global change research program out of the previous climate science, forget the name of the what it was, but it was mandated by Congress and signed into law by the president. The idea being that decision makers need to know what are the impacts today of climate change. And that was back in 1990, and actually there was a pretty long expose in the New York Times Magazine last weekend about what was going on back in 1990 and how things kind of stalled out at that point. But it is mandated by Congress. It's the short answer.
Great. Okay, well, we're at 3 o'clock now, so I think what we'll do is we'll just respond directly to any questions over email. And I just want to remind folks, feel free to email both myself or Ned if you have any questions or want to follow up with anything, both from Second Nature side and from the Climate Resilience Toolkit or anything we talked about today in the webinar. Thanks again to Ned, and thanks to everyone who joined today. And please do tune in for our next 2 webinars where we'll hear some case studies from schools that are doing a lot of really great work on resilience planning. So thanks, everyone.